Yo, what's up guys? It's the new sensation, Big O Notation here, and today I'm going to be bringing you another deck profile on the Agents of Destruction deck, but this is going to be a more hand control focused variant of the deck that I've been working with recently, and it's a lot more fun, and I've added a couple of very interesting techs in there to try and help deal with the current meta. And I think that this build of the deck is actually got a really nice matchup spread for current meta decks at the moment, just because of some of the cards that I've managed to fit in. Obviously I've done a very recent Agents of Destruction deck profile in one of my more recent videos, so I probably won't be going over as many of the effects as in depth as I did in the last video. But if you want to check out the last video, I did more of a control slanted Agents of Destruction deck that included cards like the new Majin Buu Unison, and Trunks God Sealing Technique was in there as well, to try and help stopping your opponent to play any cards basically, and then aggroing them down with your beat sticks until you can get to turn 5 and drop Salzino and guarantee an end game finisher. So if you guys are interested in that deck profile, I'll have a link in the description, and I've also got some gameplay up on my channel of that particular version of the deck. I haven't got any gameplay up of this deck yet, but I will hopefully be able to get some up in the weeks to come. I've been very busy recently, so there's been a lack of uploading, but hopefully I can start picking it up pretty soon and give you guys some more content. But we'll get straight into the deck profile. So the leader, I'm still sticking with Babidi. I think that the Soul Striker, there is a Soul Striker variant of this deck obviously, and I think if you're going to run that, you probably want to be running the Buu Unison and Trunks in that, and you want to be playing it more control rather than aggressive or mid-range. I think the Soul Striker variant is still a very strong variant. I just prefer the Babidi leader because it gives you access to the Android 13 counterplay as well as the extra card, and I think that those two cards are probably some of the best cards in the deck, so I really much prefer sticking with the Babidi leader. So he has a permanent where Agents of Destruction have no specified cost, and then when he swings he has Self-Awakening, so you can take up to one card from your life to your hand, and then you can search the top 5 cards of your deck for an Agent of Destruction. And what's specifically really nice about that is it doesn't have to be a battle card, it can be just any card with Agent of Destruction in its card name, so you can search your extra cards and your Unison cards, which is really helpful for this deck. It's Awaken, 4 or less. When your life is at 4 or less, you draw one, untap one. Then on the back side, he gains an Activate main, where you can play a 2 cost or less Agent of Destruction card from your hand. And then he also has an Activate main where you can tap 3 energy and then play an Agent of Destruction Unison from your hand with 3 markers on it. So just a really nice way to free play out your cards and ignore what specified cost restrictions might be on certain cards that you might have in your deck, such as the Unisons or any of your battle cards. And the free play a battle card every single turn is just really oppressive, because a lot of your battle cards have on play effects or they do stuff whilst they're on the board, so that can get really oppressive just throughout the game. And then, as every Agent of Destruction deck should be running, we've obviously got our copies of the 1-drop Babidi. This guy, I'm only running 3 of him because we have 4 ways to search him, so I think that running 4 of him is a little overkill, and I found that most games I can find this guy very easily on turn 1, because your leader can search the top 5 for the card that searches this. But because this card isn't an Agent of Destruction, you can't actually search this off of your top 5 search from your leader, so that's important to note. You can definitely run 4 of him if you want that added consistency for seeing him turn 1, but I think that running the 4th copy of this guy just kind of clogs the deck up a bit too much, because you're already going to see multiple copies of this guy throughout the game, and it will just mean that you have more dead draws in your deck throughout the game as it progresses onwards. And this deck is going to go into those longer turns, especially in this current meta when aggro isn't really a thing at the moment. This deck can definitely take games into those turn 5s kind of range, because it has Salzino in the deck, so you want to be ending the game on turn 5 with the Salzino auto. And so running multiple copies, or running 4 copies of Babidi, will just make the deck really inconsistent in my opinion. Another plus to running 4 copies of Babidi is it will give you an extra charge target that is blue, which is really convenient for this deck. So for this version of the deck, your main targets for energy, you want to have at least 1 blue energy, 1 green energy, and 1 yellow energy. Whereas in the last version, you just needed 1 blue energy, and it kind of set you up for the rest of the game. This version has a couple more non-Agent of Destruction cards in here that require just like 1 or 2 of each specified energy. And then obviously, to pair with the Babidi, we've got the 4 Hachiaks. You can tap 1 and discard it from your hand to bring Babidi out from your deck or drop area. And then when it's played, you can warp a battle card that costs 4 or less and bottom deck up to 3 battle cards from your opponent's drop area. So this card is actually really strong right now because some of the top decks at the moment include Cell Surge and Soul Striker, and Soul Striker is going to be running the Saiyan Instincts apes, and Cell Surge is going to run a load of drop area effects like their Cell Dark Parasite, they'll have Saiyan Instincts, they'll have Bardock the Eliminator, and they'll also have Ribriannes in there as well. So this card is actually really strong to play out for this meta. And so if you see multiple copies of him in your hand and you're against a matchup that is going to have drop area effects, I'd recommend actually keeping multiple copies of this guy in your hand. Whereas previously I would normally just toss back until you have 1. And then probably the best card in this deck, and the reason why you want to run this specific leader, in my opinion, over Soul Striker, is this extra card. This card is like Pot of Greed, except sometimes you're drawing 3 cards as well. That's how I like to think of it. So you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, add up to 2 cards with Agent of Destruction in their card name to your hand, and then place the remaining cards on the bottom of the deck. And then if you took a card from those top 2 cards, you can then take a life as well. So I'm pretty sure this isn't actually leader locked to this specific leader, but it's really strong in this deck, and it incentivizes you to run as many Agents of Destruction as possible, because it means that you'll have more of a chance of seeing the top 2 cards both be Agents of Destruction, and then that means you can take those 2 cards and take the life, and you want to be self-awakening yourself as fast as possible in this deck, because then you get to your free play backside, and you'll normally have a massive hand by the time you awaken. So even though your leader loses the draw power, you still don't need to worry about that, because you have a couple of ways to keep your hand pretty sizable throughout the game, including this card. And so you don't need to worry about losing the draw power on the backside of your leader. Just as long as you awaken as fast as possible, you can then start free playing your guys out, and it's just really strong. So you're often taking the life off of this, and so if you're seeing the top 2 cards be Agents of Destruction and taking the life, this is just a draw 3, which is obviously insane. And then because it's gaining Agent of Destruction in all areas, it's a free play because you have Babidi on the board, and this loses a specified cost and then costs 1 less, so it becomes 0 cost. So you're just 0 cost drawing 3 every single turn. Something I should mention is this also has the limit 1 keyword skill before limit 1 was printed, so you can only play 1 of these per turn. But every time you see this card, you just play it and then draw some more cards, and oftentimes you're taking this off of your search effects, even if you have multiple copies of this guy already in hand, just because you want to be getting this guy off as much as possible. This card really just carries the deck, and most of the time you're probably going to see 1 Agent of Destruction in the top 2, but those times where you see 2 is just so plus, and generally you'll see 2 at least once per game, because you'll play like 3 copies of this card a game, because it's recyclable off of your Android 13, which we'll get into later, but it's also really searchable. So yeah, that extra card is just what carries the deck, and it means that you want to be running as many AODs as possible in the deck. And so to start off with some of the 2-drops, we have the Garlic Jr. He becomes a 1-drop with Babidi on the board. He's a negate, he plays himself, and then when he's played, you can play an Agent of Destruction that costs 2 or less from your deck with its skills negated for the turn. So we have a couple of ways to synergize with that. Something important to note, and I mentioned this in the last video, is Babidi only reduces the cost of Agents of Destruction in your hand. So when you're playing a 2-drop from this Garlic Jr., it has to be an actual 2-drop. Can't be a 3-drop because it doesn't count as being reduced in your deck. But if you're free playing off of your leader's activate main because you're playing a 2 cost or less from your hand, you can in fact free play 3 costs from your hand if you have Babidi on the board, because they count as 2 cost. So we have a few cards that synergize really nicely with the Garlic Jr. And the main ones being 4 of the Lord Slug super combo and 4 of the Turles. So Lord Slug, he's a 15k unique, he's a super combo, but he doesn't draw at all when he combos. But whilst he's on the board, if your opponent plays a counterplay skill, then they have to discard 2 cards. So this card is incredibly strong because as long as it sits about on the board, your opponent's not going to really be able to counterplay, and this really carries you in a lot of matchups, especially against blue or blue-yellow decks in general, because they can't use their counterplays unless they want to be dropping 2 cards. And if they're dropping 2 cards and losing the counterplay from their hand, that's a -3, and that's insanely strong for this deck, because you're a hand control deck anyway, and so those 3 cards are going to be hugely impactful. But the only thing to watch out for is this guy has unique, so once you've brought him out, you can't bring him out again. And if you bring him out from Garlic Jr., which it will be most of the time how you play him, his skills will be negated for the turn. So the idea is you negate an attack during your opponent's turn for the Garlic Jr. effect, bring out Lord Slug, and then when it comes around to your turn, his effects will be live again, so you don't have to worry about counterplays anymore. And then the other card that you want to be mostly bringing out with the Garlic Jr. is 4 copies of the Turles. He's unique barrier, and he's very simple. When he swings, you search the top 5 cards for an Agent of Destruction. So pretty much the same as your leader's frontside auto. This is the main way that you gain a hand advantage and you maintain a hand over your opponent even when your leader flips to his backside, because it's got barrier, so it's actually really tricky to remove in this deck because you can back it up with your Garlic Jr. negates and some of your counterplays as well. And this is, if you can't find a copy of Turles early game, it can really suck for you, but you can bring it out off of Garlic Jr., which is again really helpful. So you effectively have 8 copies of Turles to wait, which will bring your hand up really nicely. But this is one of the main cards that you want to be seeing early on, because it just means that you start gaining so much advantage throughout the game. And then to round off our 2-drops, we have 4 copies of the Android 13 counterplay. This card is one of the few cards that's specifically leader locked to this leader, because to activate the counterplay skill, your leader has to have Agent of Destruction in its card name. But the counterplay skill is just incredible, especially in this hand control variant of the deck. So the counterplay is if the battle card being played has an energy cost of 3 or less, it is placed in its owner's drop area instead of being played, and then your opponent discards a card and you play this card. And then when this guy is played, you can put 2 cards with Agent of Destruction in their card names or Evil Wizard, so the Babidi, from your drop area back into the deck. So most of the time you're going to be recycling other copies of this guy or copies of your extra card to keep deck thinning. Those are generally your 2 best targets with that effect, but just the counterplay in itself is so incredibly strong. The fact that it's for 1 energy, you're stopping a card coming into play, your opponent's discarding a card, and then you're gaining a 15k body is just insane. This card is a little bit worse during this meta because most of the top decks at the moment, I would argue, are blue decks, and they're obviously not playing very many 3 costs or less, other than maybe some of the cantrips in the SS4 Vegeta ramp deck. So this card isn't crazy good at the moment, but it can still stop some really impactful cards coming in, like the 1-drop Basil Fatal Rampage. It can even stop your opponent bringing in higher dragons if they're playing the Gohan Icarus deck. It can stop a lot of things against Cell Surge because they'll be wanting to swing with their critical attackers, and it can stop some of those. It's just really nice, and anytime you get the opportunity to resolve it, it can be a really massive swing. So I'd argue that even if your opponent is just playing a 1-drop that draws a card, it's probably worth counterplaying with the Android 13 if you have the energy up, just because it's such a huge swing in tempo. And then for some of our 3-drops, we have 4 copies of the Broly. He has an activate main where you pay 1 energy and discard him from your hand to add back an Agent of Destruction from your drop area. That never really comes up because 1 energy is really expensive in this deck, because a lot of your cards cost 1 energy to play out. So you can, instead of using that effect, you can just play down a battle card from your hand if you have some of the 2-drops in your hand. So I'd argue that that effect never really comes up. But sometimes in a really simplified game state, if you're against a deck like Cell Surge or some kind of hand control deck, and you're both top decking and you top deck this, it can be really nice. But his main utility is when he's played, you get to choose one of your opponent's battle cards that cost 5 or less, KO it, and then look it up to top 3 cards of your deck and add any of them to your hand. It doesn't have to be an Agent of Destruction or anything. So similar to the Cell Surge leader, if you check the top 3 and add one, you don't actually have to show it because it can just be any card. and this is your main way to find the pieces of your deck that aren't Agent of Destruction names. So he's really important in terms of consistently going through the rest of your deck, because this deck, it can really dig through the deck for the Agents of Destruction, but for some of the cards that aren't Agents of Destruction, it can actually struggle to find them quite consistently, because it doesn't have very much natural draw, it just has a lot of searches. The only issue that I found with this deck is that it can really struggle to remove cards like the 8-drop Bojack, and obviously the 8-drop Bojack is a really big key card at the moment, but this deck, most of its removal is coming from the Broly, which will only hit 5 costs or less, and the Hachiyak, which hits 4 costs or less. So it can kind of struggle to remove the bigger guys, but you just kind of have to hope that you can get to that simplified game state before your opponent has the chance to drop cards like the 8-drop Bojack. And so some of the cards that I would argue help you the most in getting to that simplified game state are going to be 2 copies of the Lord Slug AOD and 1 copy of the Android 13 AOD. I'd really like to boost this guy, the Lord Slug specifically, up an extra copy to 3 copies in this version, but I don't actually own the 3rd copy. And I would consider upping Android 13 to 2 copies, but I don't think that taking out any of the other cards in the deck is really worth it, so I don't think that there's really space for a second Android 13 at the moment. But the Lord Slug, when he comes into play, your opponent discards a card. He also has an activate main for 1 green. Once per turn, you can play a Slugs army card from your hand with an original energy cost of 3 or less other than copies of itself. And this effect actually comes up in this version of the deck. In the previous deck profile that I did on this deck, that activate main was almost completely useless, but somebody recommended in the comments of that version that in this version of the deck I try out some of the Slugs army cards that you can play off of this effect, and I have been trying them out and they're really, really helpful. So shout out to you in the comment section, shout out to you guys for helping me put together this deck with some ideas that were actually really cool. I really like the idea of playing some Slugs armies to play off this guy. And then the Android 13, he's a 20k crit, and he has an activate main for 2 energy, which isn't once per turn, where you can choose up to one of your opponent's battle cards, KO it, and then your opponent chooses a card in their hand and places it in the drop area. So for 2 energy, you're going +2, which is insane. The reason you only run 1 of this is having multiple copies on the board doesn't give you all that much advantage, because the effect isn't once per turn anyway. So all it will give you is a 20k crit swing. And as I mentioned earlier, this deck has no trouble at all searching out its AOD pieces, so in the matchups where you need this guy, you can easily search it. I would maybe consider recommending to side a 2nd copy of this card, because this card really does work against blue decks especially, because it's your main source of removal that hits bigger cards, so it can hit out the 8-drop Bojack like I was just speaking about, and it doesn't have a restriction on the battle cards that it can KO, as long as they don't have barrier. So against blue decks, this card is just really, really strong, because it will give you consistent advantage, which is what you need against blue decks. And it will also give you some removal, which you wouldn't otherwise have access to. So maybe consider siding a 2nd copy of the Android 13 for blue decks. And it can be okay against Cell Surge, but that's kind of only if you're already in a somewhat even or winning position, which I feel like early game most of the time you won't be against that deck. Or not early game, sorry, mid game, which is when you kind of want to be dropping this guy. You want to drop this guy like around turn 4, I'd say, and by that point you'll probably be starting to peter out against the Cell Surge deck, because they'll be starting to actually really take apart your hand. But it can still be good against Cell Surge. I haven't properly tested that matchup yet, but in theory it could be pretty good. And then another AOD that I'm running is 1 copy of the TP Bojack. He's basically a deadly defender for battle cards that cost equal to or greater than their opponent's current energy. He can come in for 1 energy after being comboed with, and when he's KO'd he draws a card. So he's just really nice again for those decks that can drop bigger cards, like blue decks, because it makes it just harder for your opponent to kill you on their kill turn. And so Android 13 and Bojack can really pair together to take down the decks that can go long and drop those big cards. I would recommend maybe considering cutting this guy for the 3rd copy of Lord Slug. I would argue that this is one of the weaker cards in the deck, but I don't own the 3rd copy of Lord Slug, so I'm still running it. I would definitely recommend side decking this guy though, because it can be really clutch against those decks that can drop big guys, especially against decks like Aggro Sin. just because they drop a bunch of big cards and try and kill you quickly, and this card can kind of carry you in those matchups. But yeah, it's not bad, and it's also another blue card in the deck, which takes you up to a total of, I think, 12 blue cards. So it's really helpful in terms of getting to you that blue energy, which you need for Senzu Beans, which we're obviously running in this deck, because Senzu Bean in a rainbow deck is kind of just a staple. It's an insane card. For the Unison of choice, I'm sticking with 2 Vegeta Unison. I think that this card is just really good to run in any sort of Agent of Destruction deck because of how easily accessible it is. I could consider cutting this guy down to 1 because it's kind of situational and it's really easy to search out. But I'm just running 2 at the moment. If you want to keep the Bojack in and you want to run 3 copies of the Lord Slug, you could maybe cut this guy down to 1. But I think 2 is probably the correct number. In this version of the deck, you may notice I'm not running the Majin Buu Unison at all. I think that it's a little bit too expensive for this version of the deck, and it doesn't give you as much advantage as some of the other cards would. I would recommend side decking the Majin Buu Unison and the Trunks as well, just for those matchups where you need that extra counterplay and that extra like blocker and removal off of the -1. So maybe for those more like aggro mid-range matchups, you want to be running those cards. But I'm just not running it at the moment. I think that the side deck is probably the correct place for this version of the deck. Just because there's really not that much space. Like, this deck has really very little space at the moment. So for some of the Slugs army cards that I'm running 2 copies of the Lord Slug Super Namekian and 1 copy of Anguilla the Graceful Warrior. I was originally running 2 of each, and sorry, you may notice for the proxy, this is the one card I'm missing from this deck and I cannot find it anywhere. So I just figured I wanted to proxy it because I want to give you guys the video as soon as possible. But these are the 2 cards that you bring out from your Lord Slug Agent of Destruction from the Tap a Green effect. And these 2 cards are just insanely strong during this format. I was running 2 of the Anguilla, but I found that it was a little bit lackluster, and I was just charging it most of the time, so I just cut it down to 1. And I think I'm going to side deck a copy of this guy as well, so that I can bring it in against the matchups where you need it. So the Lord Slug Super Namekian, what he does, he's a unique barrier 20k, and he has Bond 2. When this card is in rest mode, your opponent can't add cards from their deck to their hand using non-leader skills, which is insanely strong for this format because this format is all about advantage. It's either Cell Surge trying to rip your hand apart, or blue and yellow decks trying to draw through their entire deck and just gain a massive hand. So against blue and yellow decks, this card just hard carries you, and they don't have enough barrier removal to deal with it consistently. And if you can back it up with cards like your Garlic Jr. negate as well, then this guy can just become really unkillable, because you have really nice negates in the deck, and the counterplay with the Android 13 as well. And then Anguilla is just nice. It's a 15k crit and Bond 2. If your opponent has 4 or more cards in rest mode, when she attacks, your opponent chooses 2 of those cards in rest mode, and they can't be switched to active mode until the start of their next turn. So this card is again good against blue-yellow, because the fact that they can't be switched to active mode means that if they want to be using cards like Senzu Bean, or they want to be using the Aegis Bojack, and they have some of their energy in rest mode, you can swing with Anguilla and force them to keep some of their energy tapped down until the start of their next turn, which is just really nice because it means they can't untap it forcibly with any cards that I just mentioned before. It's obviously not going to be as good as the Lord Slug because the Lord Slug has barrier. It just sits on the board and stops your opponent from gaining too much advantage, which is especially good in this more hand control version of the deck. But it's still, Anguilla's still a good card, and the fact that it's critical is obviously nice for trying to whittle away your opponent's resources. We've got 4 copies of Senzu Bean. We run a lot of blue cards in this deck just inherently. We run 4 copies of Turles, 3 copies of Babidi, and 1 copy of the Bojack. And the Bojack is arguably one of the weaker cards in the deck for most matchups, and the Babidi is very weak if you dead draw it later on in the game and you already have copies out. So those are very easy charges, and Senzu Bean is just really strong in this deck because, as I mentioned before, 1 energy is a lot of energy in this deck, because most of your battle cards cost 1 energy, so you just drop Bean, gain a free energy, and then further aggressively push throughout the game, which is really nice. And then a card which I hadn't even thought about, wasn't even on my radar until someone specifically mentioned that you could run it in this deck, was 2 copies of Zamasu the Eliminator, and I'm currently debating running a third copy of this card as well. This card is obviously insane in this format, and I feel like it's kind of warping the format back into a multicolor format, other than Cell Surge, although technically Cell Surge is a multicolor leader. But the main utility in this deck, so my argument for running this over copies of the Majin Buu Unison and the Trunks Negate was that obviously with the Android 13 you're already going to be hitting out, you're already going to be able to counterplay those low cost battle cards, and this only gives you counterplays on energy cost, on battle cards that cost energy of 4 or less. So it's really not that much better than the Android 13, especially when you take into the fact that it costs 1 more energy, and it also costs specific energy, so you have to have a blue and a yellow energy to use it. But I realized that you're running a lot of blue and yellow cards in this deck anyway, so the energy requirement isn't too steep, it's just the fact that it costs 2 energy. But I was taking a look at some of the more popular decks at the moment, and obviously, like I've been mentioning throughout this whole video, because this deck, in my opinion, is a decent metacal because it has good matchups across some of the stronger decks at the moment. And the stronger decks are mostly being Cell Surge and blue decks or yellow decks, but mostly blue decks that abuse the Majin Buu Unison. And so Cell Surge is going to be aiming to drop the Dark Broly Unison on turn 3 every single game, and those blue decks are going to be looking to abuse the Majin Buu Unison on turn 4 every single game. And a lot of what they won't expect when playing against Agents of Destruction is for them to have a Zamasu counterplay in their deck. So oftentimes you often want to be leaving 2 energy open during your opponent's turn anyway, so that you have your Android 13 live and your Garlic Jr. Negate live, because those give you a lot of advantage during your opponent's turn. But if you are against one of those blue decks or a Cell Surge deck, and going into their turn 3 or turn 4, you just happen to be able to leave 2 energy open and you have the Zamasu in hand, you can just delay their turn by an entire, or you can delay their game by an entire turn, which is really insanely strong. And if people aren't playing around this card in this deck, which I wouldn't expect them to because it's a very obscure inclusion, because it's not inherently a blue-yellow deck at all, then it can really catch them off guard. The only issue with running multiple copies of this card, and why I haven't got it as straight up 4 copies, is this deck, it doesn't want to be charging energy exhaust cards. So because this card won't have its energy exhaust negated because you're not a blue-yellow deck, charging this on any turn is gonna feel awful, because like I've been saying throughout this whole video, 1 energy is a lot of energy in this deck. And so if you're charging this turn 1, which you might think is the optimal time to charge it, you can't play out Babidi until turn 2, and that delays your entire game by 1 turn. And then if you're charging this at any turn later than that, you're just going to be preventing yourself from being able to play as many cards down and gain so much advantage during your turn when you want to be going aggressive. So that's why I haven't got this card at a straight up 4 copies, and also this deck space is really, really tight at the moment. And I want to keep it at a clean 50 as with all of my decks. I would consider bumping this guy up to 3, or at least siding the 3rd copy for those matchups that I just mentioned, for Cell Surge and for Majin Buu decks, or blue decks that run with the Majin Buu Unison. I'd definitely recommend siding a 3rd copy at least, but 2 copies is kind of okay. It's kind of a card where if you see it, it's really good, and if you don't see it, it's kind of fine anyway. So you don't need to max out on copies at all with it, because this deck has its own game plan that isn't tied into the Zamasu. But I definitely recommend siding a 3rd copy for those matchups. And also, something that I found that this card really struggles with in this deck is, like I've mentioned before, this deck doesn't have much natural inherent draw power. It just has searchability throughout the Agents of Destruction, so you can really struggle to find this card, which is why I've been trying to find space for a 3rd copy in the main deck instead of just in the side deck. So another card that ties into that, not having enough natural draw, I'm actually running 2 copies of Bardock Awakened Instincts, and in short, this card is just to help you with gaining some more natural draw throughout the deck. The idea is that throughout your turn 1, turn 2, and turn 3, you're going to be searching for a bunch of AoDs off of your leader effect. On turn 2, you should be dropping Turles. On turn 1, you should be searching Babidi out from your deck. So you're going to be deck thinning quite a lot for your engine specific cards. And then after turn 3 or around turn 3 would be when you start dropping Brolys, and that will fill up your drop area for Overrealm. and you'll probably have a few extra cards in there from playing them in the early turns. So you should have enough at over round 4, around turn 3, turn 4, and that's when you can start dropping this guy, and he will just deck thin you further for cards like Zamasu, which is the perfect time to be getting Zamasu is turn 3, turn 4, because that'll be when your opponent sets up the big unison. So you can drop this in hopes to search for a Zamasu. You can also drop this in hopes to search for your Lord Slug engine in the matchups where that's relevant. And it's just a really nice card to dig through your deck a little bit further. And in testing, I've just found that this card has really overperformed. And you could argue that you could cut this card down and add a copy of the Zamasu in and a copy of, say, the Lord Slug in. And that would kind of balance it out, because then you'd still have a lot of cards that you want. Like, you'd just have more copies of the cards that you're wanting to draw off of this guy. But because this guy offers you an extra 20k swing, and he gives you 2 draws, and then you can drop a card, so he just lets you see more cards. I think that this card is just better than running more copies of the matchup specific cards. And so for some of the finishers in the deck, I am running one of the SS4 Bardock fighting against Fate and one copy of Salzino. So Salzino is obviously incredible in this deck because a lot of your deck is green and yellow. You have your Lord Slug engine, which adds even more yellow stuff to it, but you also have the Agent of Destruction, Lord Slug, and Android 13s. Your Garlic Jr. is yellow, your Lord Slug Super Combo is green. You just have a lot of different green-yellow cards in this deck. And they're all either 2 or 3 cost, so they're some of the easiest numbers that you can add up to 12, because you can have 4 3 costs, you can have 3 2 costs and 2 3 costs, you can have 6 2 costs, which I have had a few times where you have to drop Salzino on top of like 6 2 costs. It's just the best secret rare in this deck in my opinion, and the fact that this deck very easily goes to turn 5 because it doesn't have or it has some decent aggression, but if your opponent is dropping Floodgate negates like Baby Hatch or like Son Gohan Baby's Minion or any Floodgate negates like that, then you just kind of wait until turn 5 and then drop Salzino and guarantee yourself the win. And I feel like this deck really lacked a finisher, and so when I added Salzino, it just made the deck entirely so much better. And then one fighting against Fate, I think that this card is just kind of the best Overrealm in any sort of given deck that wants to kill your opponent. So I think most people will agree that this card is just really strong, and this card and Secret Identity Mask Saiyan probably both compete for the best Overrealm slot, but I would argue this one is the best. That's pretty much it for the main deck, and I'm just going to go into a couple of cards that I would like to consider, either for side deck options or for potential main deck candidates as well, if you want to cut some of the weaker cards like the Bojack TP. So obviously, if any of you saw my last deck profile that I did on versions of this deck, you would know that I was running 3 of the Majin Buu, and I was also running 3 Trunks. I think that cutting it down to 2 Trunks now would probably be correct, but just some sort of ratio of these is good either in the side deck or the main deck. I'm not running it in this version just because it's quite a large engine, it's 5 cards, and deck space in this deck is very tight. And I've also found that if you see multiple copies of the Unison, as well as the fact that you already have 2 Unisons in here, it just makes it a little bit more cloggy in terms of having diminishing returns come into effect when you have quite a small, or when you have any sort of hand size at all. But obviously Trunks is really good as a card, and it's going to help you deal with those slower matchups where the opponent's trying to drop big stuff on you, like Baby Golden Avenger or like the 8-drop Bojack. You can just Trunks it back to their hand if you have the Unison down. And so that's really good. And then the Majin Buu Unison obviously helps you in those more aggressive matchups because it will give you consistent draw power, which will be helpful against decks like Cell Surge, and it will give you consistent removal and blocker. And then, like I mentioned as well, I think side decking the 3rd copy of Zamasu the Eliminator is a good shout, just for matchups where they want to play a big Unison down. Something that I should probably mention is, obviously this card has a lot of surprise factor in this deck, I'd argue, because it's not a blue-yellow deck, so a lot of players will not even consider the fact that Zamasu the Eliminator can be played in non-blue-yellow decks. But once you've played this card against your opponent and caught them off guard like that, they probably won't play into it so much again. And so once you've played into it once, or once they've played into it once and you drop it, you could even consider just siding this card out and playing better cards for the matchup, if there are any better cards. If there aren't better cards, just keep this guy in. But if you you could end up just siding this guy out as well, if once the surprise factor is gone. I'm not sure how really how well that would work. I think that the card is still good and you should still run it, but it could be something to consider. The main card that I've been going really back and forth about is 2 copies of the Bojack Agent of Destruction. And I know that this is a bit more of an obscure card and a lot of people don't consider it when they come to building this deck, but I think that this card is really insane and people really underestimate it. So it's got a skill: when you play it, you just switch one of your opponent's battle cards to rest mode. One of the main advantages of that skill is that it actually ignores barrier, so you can switch copies of any sort of 1-drops that they might have that have barrier, like the Borgos, cantrips, or like Babidi in this deck. If you're playing against a mirror match and you drop this, it will just rest a Babidi and you can attack into it. But it can also rest cards like the Violent Rush Bojack, which is obviously a very prominent card at the moment. But it also just resting any battle card that doesn't have barrier is a nice thing so that you can swing into it consistently. But the main point of this card is that it has an activate main for 2 energy. If this card is in rest mode, you choose one of your opponent's leader cards, or you choose your opponent's leader, and then switch it to rest mode, and it cannot be switched to active mode until the end of your opponent's next turn. So this is very similar to the 4-drop Sin Shenron, except that it stays in rest mode. It's not that it can't attack, it just stays in rest mode. And it also gets switched to rest mode, so if you're against a Sin Xeno deck, you can use this to get around that blocker on the leader. But it's also the fact that this guy, you can do that every single turn for 2 energy, so you can keep their leader locked as long as this guy stays on the board. And the main advantage to this card, which I will show you, is if you can get this guy out in tandem with the Lord Slug Super Namekian, it just kind of shuts a lot of slower decks down at the moment. So this combo will very easily shut down a lot of blue decks. Like if you're against a Soul Striker deck and they can't be swinging with their leader, they're going to be missing out on a draw 1, untap 2 every single turn. And then you have this guy in rest mode preventing them from gaining any sort of draw power outside of their leader. So they're not able to swing with their leader to gain any advantage, and they're not able to draw off of any other cards unless they can get through a 20k barrier or a 20k guy in rest mode. The only issue that I found with this card is that obviously it doesn't have any sort of protection, so removing it isn't the toughest thing in the world. If you can get that combo down at all early on, it's going to be devastating to any sort of advantage based deck, and it can really make them squirm and make them struggle to deal with anything that you can put out. And if you can obviously back this guy up with your Lord Slug Super Namekian and back that up with your Garlic Junior negate and your Android 13 counterplay, it just kind of locks them out of the game in most decks, because they'll just really struggle. So if you're playing against any sort of slower blue decks where the leader needs to be attacking to gain them advantage, especially Soul Striker, I think Soul Striker is the main card or the main deck that this guy comes in against. I definitely recommend you side deck this guy and maybe even main deck it, because another pro of him is that he's yellow, so he's going to be a yellow energy for your Zamasu the Eliminator, but he's also a yellow card for Salzino. So he's actually really strong, and I'd maybe consider cutting the blue Bojack that I have in the deck at the moment for this guy. He's really good. And then for some of the last cards to consider, and cards that I would probably side deck, I just have the last copy of Anguilla and the second copy of the Bojack. Anguilla is just good against those slower matchups like blue-yellow, and Bojack is good against those decks that drop bigger guys, like any sort of Sin aggro deck or just big guys in general. So that's pretty much all of the cards that I would consider that are in archetype or themed around this deck for side deck or main deck. I hope you guys enjoyed the deck profile. I know that I've already profiled a very similar list on my channel recently, but I wanted to give you guys both takes on the Agents of Destruction decks that I've been toying around with, and I really like this version especially. I think that this version is just has a lot of good matchups at the moment, and it can do a lot of unsuspected things. So I'm a really big fan of this deck, and I'll try and get some gameplay up of this deck at some point as well, especially if I can get some cool Bojack combos off with the Bojack Lord Slug combo that I was talking about. If I can pull that off against some blue decks, that'll be really, really amazing, and I'll definitely show off some games if I can get that done. But thank you guys very much for watching, as always. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a like and support me by subscribing. If you didn't enjoy the video, give it a dislike and let me know why you didn't enjoy it in the comments. I always appreciate some good feedback. So thank you guys very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.